Hello, welcome to the Redmond Historical Society Saturday Speaker Series for Aerojet Rocketdyne, Then, Now, and to the Future with Company Program Manager Jack Deboer. I'm Holly Turner, the host for today's program. Thank you for joining us for our first hybrid program. We're glad to have you joining us today in person at the Old Redmond Schoolhouse and online. For those of you on Zoom, please confirm that you can see and hear us using the chat button. Just click at the bottom of your screen to open the chat window. You can then select who you would like to send the message to by clicking on the drop down next to "To," type your message and press enter to send it. We'd also like to know, how did you hear about this program and who is listening with you today? And how many of you have heard of Rocketeers in Redmond? We'll also have a Q&A session at the end of today's program. Please use the chat to send us any questions or comments you would like to share. And for those of you attending in person, please hold your questions until the end of the program today. Now, before we get started, I'd like to introduce President John Ofterbro for a few words about the Society. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Holly, wherever you are. It's like the Wizard of Oz, behind the curtain. Well, thank you. Next time we'll have that a little louder for those of you in the front row or the back row, but this is a learning experience, so bear with us as we go through this today. But welcome back. It's so great to see all of you here in person and 33 or 35 people online. So give yourselves a hand out there for joining us. You know, it's been 2.5 years since we last met as a group, and that was, over in the public safety building. Before that, it was in the senior center. You all know what happened to that. We've been on the move. We moved our office 3 times since 2018. And here we are back in the building. And many of you who come here in person have witnessed our cool little museum and office. So inviting you all to come back. It's helpful if you will call Holly at the office to make sure that she's there and know you're coming, but we'd love to have you come by and spend more time in our museum. Thanks to many of you who are online out there over the past 2 years when we all learned about Zoom, that thing like your mic's not on or turn your mic off. Anyway, we've had over 100 people who have tuned in faithfully over the last couple of years. And so we're going to continue to try to do that too. As you know, we have focused mainly on Redmond's older history over the years. We've got that all lined up. We've discovered that we just haven't paid enough attention to the modern history, the science, the technology, and all those things that have been happening in Redmond since rocket research moved here, opened up years ago. You're going to hear all about that today. And a little company called Microsoft. Facebook's coming. And SpaceX is out there. And Genie has been here. And anyway, we're going to try to focus a little more on that in the next couple of years in our presentations. So a special thanks to our volunteers. Raise your hand, volunteers today who helped us set this up. Okay, look at that. Thank you all for doing that. And special thanks to Holly Turner. Where are you, Holly? She's still behind the curtain. Anyway, she's our administrative manager in the office. Keeps everything cooking 3 days a week, Monday through Wednesday. And without her, we'd be sunk. She's just doing a super job. And thank you to our board members too. And raise your hand, board members out there. Look at them. There's a few of us here. I do have a special request though. And Mary, one of our board members, is going to pass these around. This is a volunteer sign-up sheet because we need a few more people on our committees. We have 2 open spaces on our board. And for any of you who want to have a lot of fun with us, it's a working board, it's a fun board, but we want to carry on preserving and educating people in the community about Redmond's rich history. Joanne, where are you? Okay, Joanne, stand up, Joanne. Joanne is our volunteer coordinator. And a couple of years ago, I put an article in my president's notes that says, we sure need a new volunteer coordinator. She called me the next day. That's the kind of volunteers we like to have, of course, but she does a great job. So if you feel like asking questions of me or Holly or Joanna or any of the other board members, please do that. We'd love your help. The following is our recognition of the first peoples here in Redmond. We acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples who continue to steward these lands and waters as they have since time immemorial. We recognize Washington's tribal and indigenous or native organizations which actively create, shape, and contribute to our thriving communities. The Redmond Historical Society is committed to doing our part to engage with and amplify the voices of Native peoples and tribes. And you can view some of our examples of that on our timeline in the office, just to the left as you turn in. And now I'd like to introduce Laura Lee Bennett, who's our Vice President and Program Chairman. Laura Lee. Over there and sit down.
Let's make a deal.
They can hear you.
Yes, can you hear me? Great. I believe we need to pull up the speakers line.
I can do that.
Oh, there. Just one moment, please. There we go. All right, here we all are. It's so lovely to see your faces. It's so nice to be back in the schoolhouse. Welcome. It's been a long time since we've been setting up in this room. Some of you probably remember our speaker programs, and this is our new hybrid world. But thank you so much for bearing with us. I would like to introduce today's speaker. One more moment, please. And there we are. Thank you, Holly. Saved us once again. Yay! Hey! Our speaker today, Eastside resident Jack Deboer, is a program manager at Aerojet Rocketdyne, who leads teams that develop and support the fabrication of propulsion systems and rocket engines for launch and space vehicles. He holds an MS in program management, an MS in engineering, and a Bachelor of Science degree in mechanical engineering. Jack has been involved with rocket engines for 38 years. Welcome, Jack. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you very much, Laura Lee. Yes. Yeah, you're jumping ahead. That's okay. Well, we're jumping 2 years ahead.
Hang on.
That's okay.
Well, go back.
That's all right. We'll get this.
We'll figure it out.
All right, here we go. I have to say, I'm really impressed with the turnout today, and I'm actually very thankful for the opportunity to come out and talk a little bit. I'll call it the bridge between what I'll call was the then and where we are today and where the future goes. So this is sort of a good blend of what John and Laura Lee have been talking about, which is that there's a certain history of Redmond, but there's also a future of Redmond. You know, a lot of high technology companies have come, to the east side here to relocate in this area. So I hope to present to you today some insight on a small company that's now called Aerojet Rocketdyne and how this plays with respect to the history and where we have come from. So where are we actually located? Up on the screen behind me, what you see is Aerojet Rocketdyne, located off of Willows Road at more or less the intersection of Willows and 116. So it's the very northwest corner of Redmond is where we're specifically talking about. Why is that important? Well, for two reasons. One, it's part of what we could call, the local Willows technology corridor. Certainly a lot of high technology companies and even I believe Facebook is coming aboard. But it also is reflective of what you see in the frame here, part of the Sammamish River Valley, right? So there's a lot of history that has to do with farming or lumber or whatnot. But up on the hill off of 116th is located Aerojet Rocketdyne. And what you also see here is that we have lots of interesting characters on site. You would never think that, being so close to the city and in the middle of things that we would get, call it foreign actors, but certainly here in the month of June, we had a couple of black bears rolling around the property. So, we're not as deep in the city as one would think. And that's sort of a good thing because, again, it's reflective of the environment that we live in and the stewardship that we are given to behold not only what we do, in our lives and our occupation, but stewards of the earth. So we certainly respect the bears rolling around and the deer and the whatnot. But anyway, gives you a perspective that we're not alone. Oops, wrong way. Let's go this way. So where do we start? The story starts in 1889, where a husband and wife, Ron and Mary Crawford, actually decided to plat an area in the northwest of Redmond here that they called the town of York. And up on the screen, what you see is the meandering at the time Sammamish River, and just to the left or the west is the railroad spur, and then the town of York that then occupied what was to be a plat. So this area became known as York. And in fact, if you look around in even today's literature, what you'll see is references to York in the area that we are going to talk about. Well, back in 1904, along that Sammamish River Valley, there were various gun clubs, for, rich people, I would suppose, that would come out and decide that they needed to do something on weekends. And one of them, James Kleiss, he named his property Willowmore, which is now known as Marymore. And I would suspect that the road, which is now Willows, had a derivative based on that. C.D. Stimpson, I think he was a lumber baron, you may correct me if I'm wrong here, but he named his club the Willows. So there's a lot of commonality. Eventually then that road that's adjacent to that railroad spur became known as Willows Road. That's where we are today. Back in 1918 then, King County actually purchased the land and it became known as Willows Farm for $126,000. That sounds like a bargain, but I would suspect at the time that was a lot of money. So 420 acres then went with that to the county. Well, it turns out that, the area, the state, the nation was dealing with a lot of what we would call lazy husbands. And there was a bill passed in the state of Washington to address the growing problem at the time of husbands that would not really support their family. Call them deadbeat dads or whatever the right terminology here is. And so what they did is they built a stockade, which became known as the Willows Stockade, on the property. And there are two views. There may be more, I don't know, but I've only seen two pictures of the stockade. One taken in 1925, and then the one on the right taken a little bit later. And there's a couple of features here that I want to point out. The building on the left, taken in 1925, just seems to be a flat single-story structure, while as the picture on the right seems to show a second story's been added along with the fence line. And you might ask, well, what's the significance of this stockade? Where is it located? Well, it was actually located at 116th and Willows up on top of the hill, as we will certainly see here in a couple of slides. So there may be more photos out there, as we'll find out, this operation kind of stood for about 10 years. So I'm surprised that more photos haven't come forward, but perhaps it was because it was a delinquent dad prison. I don't know. So what was the purpose of this deadbeat dad's prison? Well, they housed prisoners that were sent there to tend land, to grow crops, to build and repair roads, such as 116th. In the day, it was referred to as York Road. So at nighttime, then the inmates would return to their cells. You know, the warden would lock things up and they would go on. At the time then, they were trying to, you know, take whatever the goods were sold or the work purpose, and they would give money back to those families of those delinquent fathers. Well, it turned out that rumors had circulated back in the day in what I'll call the late 20s, that a lot of the prisoners did not want to go home. They wanted to hang around, and it turned out that they had spent their time drinking on the premises. So, you know, if you had the opportunity to enjoy life in the prison, work a little bit, tend the garden, grow a vegetable, yeah, they were all for it. Well, this was during the era of Prohibition. And it turned out in 1928, King County actually shut down the facility in a big, huge scandal, because it turned out that the warden of this stockade was kind of tending the prisoners and had them cooking moonshine up in the bush in the hill, right? So the federal guys came in, they busted up the stills, you know, the whole thing went sideways. And pretty soon after that, the state basically nixed this wayward husband's law. Well, so it turned out that by 1932, King County had abandoned this site that we saw in a couple of photos earlier, and they had leased the land and whatever remained of the equipment to an intermediary operator. Really didn't do much. So the county in 1942 sold the land, obviously at a big loss, for about $55,000. What I've been able to determine is that that stockade was demolished sometime after 1936, and we'll show you why. I was actually able to sort of figure out where the stockade was actually located by utilizing King County available GIS data mapping sources. So what you see in the photo in the upper left-hand corner is what I would call a modern day picture of the site. You can see a couple of addresses here. The one on the lower middle of the frame on the right, that's actually the Ralph James house, and we'll come back to that in a few slides. But he lived there, and what you see going kind of a little bit diagonally to the right is actually 116th Avenue as it comes up the hill. So what I was able to do with the GIS mapping is I found some aerial photography that was taken in 1936, and they have pinpointed on it locators. So you pretty much know through this view on the left, lower left, that prison was still existing. You kind of see the fence line there. And based on the shadows that are cast in this photo, you could see that it was the second story type of building with a little porch and overhang. So it's apparent that there had been some improvements from the 1925 photo that's shown on the right, where there's a second story, which again matches up with that later photo taken. So what I was able to do then was marry up, all of the evidence, and there's not much out there, though. I actually have a task for any one of you members to go out and do some research if you have some extra time to find out a little bit more information about it. But what you see in the photo here is the second story on the shadow. You see the porch that again tied up with the first photo. And again, that marries up pretty cleanly with this photo on the right that was taken during that Mickelson collection. So where is it located when we think of today? Oops, did I do this? Yeah, here we go. Its actual location, I kind of took both photos and mapped them on top of each other. And what you see is that the stockade was almost located just at the top of the hill at 116th with the Ralph James house there. At the bottom of the hill, you kind of see it in the photo here, is the Ares home. I think there was actually an article written in 2009 or something like that regarding one of the original RHS presidents knew the family, went there and whatnot. So that's a significant story in of itself. And then in the upper photo, what you see is a dairy farm. Now, why this discussion? Well, it turned out that there were some brothers, Ray and Archie Nelson, along with another gentleman, Ralph James. They created a dairy farm called York Farm. And they actually did quite well. They were awarded King County's Conservation Farmers of the Year in '55 and the Dairy Family of the Year a little bit later. And they were into artificial insemination. And they had a key bull that was called Century Sire. And their basic key slogan in 1961 was "Rocket your herd to the future with a Century Sire." Well, that's somewhat prophetic, because of what we became. Anyway, it turned out at the time, King County was looking at this area and they wanted to marry up that Sammamish Valley with Totem Lake. And the natural road actually was 116th Avenue, because if you recall, that was called York Avenue, and that had been fairly well built up by the prisoners. Well, Ralph James, who was, again, one of the owners of York Farm, protested that that road was going to go right through his house, which again still exists. So they actually at the time said, yeah, all right, we'll move the road north, which then became Northeast 124th Avenue, right? So that's the main road across, whereas now 116th just goes across the valley here by 60 acres and pretty much dead ends at the top of the hill because they did not pull it through there. So back in 1968, a company, small little company at the time that was started by 4 gentlemen called Rocket Research Company moved from South Park over to the east side here and purchased 120 acres of that land for development. And it was actually rezoned by the city of Redmond, and it was negotiated by the famous John Ehrlichman of Watergate fame, the President Nixon debacle. So there was a little bit of a tie-in there to national politics. In any event, that property included the Nelson farm and the Ares home at the bottom of the hill, where Albert and Ares and his wife Carolyn had purchased that home, and it was actually once a Willows Grammar School. I don't know too much about that side of, call it the local educational history, but certainly there's probably something out there worth digging into. In any event, the negotiation in 1968 was that Albert and his wife Carolina could stay in that building, in that house, until he passed, and that's exactly what happened. So he passed away in 1992, and then that building, was taken down, and then the frontage along Willows, about 15 acres, was actually sold to Quadrant. So that's what built up what I'll call the vast number of existing call it light industrial buildings there that are right now. So what we're doing is we're transitioning from what I'll call the early years from farming to what we'll call now is the modern era. So Rocket Research Company acquired that land, and they were actually formed in 1960, where these guys, the early pioneers of what we'll talk about, were into everything. They designed, fabricated, tested all kinds of rocket engines for what we'll call our launch vehicles, space vehicle applications, ground testing, explosives. They were all over the place. They dealt with solids, they dealt with exotic propellants, all of the crazy stuff. So I kind of went through, there's a great summary history that people within the company can look at, but these guys were the first ones to develop airbag technologies, right? So the stuff that we now take for granted was actually started with the company. Fire suppression systems. There were a lot of incidences where policemen or highway patrolmen were severely injured during crashes that would, catch the cars on fire. So there were fire suppression systems fabricated by the Rocket Research Company that were then installed to, help save the lives of those first responders. There's also an interesting aspect where the company owned a small remote control gas powered little race cars. So they would, put gas in and they would just all zip around, and they owned that. They dealt with guided munitions. There were deep sea buoy recovery things where, they were setting records all the time, going down, attaching these, buoys to sunken, call it, boats or whatever, and then they would inflate them, and then they would come up to the surface. They were also providing emergency slide inflator systems on 747, so the ones that come off of the plane in emergency landings, electronics, all of that. So they were also at the forefront of what I'll call is the rocket engine development and propulsion systems that we'll get into here shortly. So in the middle years, 1968, what you see up on the screen on the upper left year is kind of the virgin property, if you will, at the time. You can see in the small detail, the Aries home, you can see the Nelson Brothers farm, and then what took place after that, would call it the topology regrading, and then the building of the current company. So if you actually go on the property, or if you can get on it, what you'll see are buildings that are circa 1960, right? So they have that old dated look, but certainly they do serve the purpose. They do serve the test facilities, they do serve the engineering, they do serve the administration. So those buildings are still standing, and I don't think there's any desires or changes for the future, but certainly it's an interesting aspect where they have been up since 1968 and providing things. So Rocket Research at the top of the screen here, has gone through quite a number of changes where it was acquired by Olin Flares, if you're familiar with that large chemical company, that was then spun off into Primex Technologies. There was a merger with Kaiser, and then eventually General Dynamics came into the picture here. And then we were purchased about 2004 or so by Aerojet, full transition, and then eventually merged with Pratt & Whitney, Aerojet Rocketdyne to form the company that we are today. So in all of these morphings and transitions, what's come about is that the Aerojet Rocketdyne facility in Redmond right now is primarily concentrated on rocket engines. So all of the history and the other things that we have done have gone, with the other companies as part of sell-offs or the merger process. So a little quick rocket engine primer for those that kind of sort of understand it, but maybe don't. I'll try to keep it in simple terms here, but you're basically taking potential or stored energy and somehow converting it into kinetic, or what we call moving energy. The diagram on the right, is not real, detailed or whatnot, but what it's intended to show is what we call Sir Isaac Newton's third law, which is for, every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the idea here is that rocket engines derive movement or thrust based on what we'll call is the force equals mass times acceleration principle, or a momentum change. So I'm pushing a mass at a velocity in one direction, and I'm pushing my mass at a different velocity in another. What's at really the core of all of this, not to get too detailed here, is that science, technology, engineering, and math is really at the core of rocket science. And if you have the opportunity, I know that there are some Rocketeers out here. If you have the opportunity, try to emphasize any of these STEM ideas to the kids and youth of today. It's so hard to get them motivated in the technology industries, but personally, I've found it rewarding with the types of things that we do, and it just opens up a lot of opportunities where things need to go. Real quickly then, when we talk about rocket engines, there are, generally speaking, three different segmented areas. We talk about solids, these are solid propellants, or we talk about liquids, where you either decompose something or you combine the liquids to make your thrust, or there's even what we'll call as the more exotic stuff that's of Hollywood-esque fame, which is electric propulsion. So when we talk about solids, these are generally speaking, not real accurate or controllable, but man, they have a lot of punch. They can keep, generally speaking, they keep going till they run out of fuel. An example being the pending Artemis 1 launch, that's the Space Systems launch. That's the endeavor of the United States to go back to the moon. If you've been watching the news lately, they had a couple of fuel problems that has delayed the launch, but they are slated to get that vehicle, I think they're talking about launching now either the 23rd or the 27th of the month. The remarkable thing is that this has two solid rocket boosters on each side. In of itself, those things push about 7.2 million pounds of thrust. So it gives you a sense of how powerful these engines are. And in fact, this vehicle will be the largest launch vehicle ever. So if you go back to, say, Saturn V, this is bigger than that. So it'll be a real light show if you're able to see it online or have the opportunity to go to Cape Canaveral in Florida. A step down further are the liquids. They're generally a lot smaller, but you can control a liquid through the application of valving, right? You can start it, you can stop it. A good example are the shuttle orbiter engines, that everybody's familiar with through the shuttle launch. Generally speaking, the range is about 5 hundredths of a pound to about 1,000 pounds. So it gives you a little bit broader range. And then we talk about electric propulsion that'll utilize something like a xenon gas and ion and Hall current thrusters where they're pushing in the millipound range. So what we talk about today, what do we do up in Redmond? We're involved with that small class of liquid and electric propulsion engines. So not the big stuff that you see on the screen, not the smoke, fire, and thunder stuff, but the little stuff, because it's all part of what I'll call rocketeering, performance and how we support everything. So real quickly, what we talk about, and what I'm going to do is kind of just bridge out a little bit to talk about what satellites are all about. So they're low Earth, generally speaking, anywhere from the ground up to about 1,200 miles. That are fast moving, right? These things have to go pretty quickly so that they do not decay and auger in back into the land here. But they generally speaking move west to east or north to south orientation. That's simply because of how they are launched. Examples are the International Space Station, Worldview, they take pictures from above that you can see on the nightly news. And then certainly the new endeavor by the SpaceX folks, Starlink, right? How that is helping speed up what I'll call are the communications to the ground, the web access and whatnot. We then transition up into medium Earth orbit, which is about 1,200 miles to 22,000 miles up. They're moving faster, but they're typically what we call a complex orbit. Those medium Earth orbit things support GPS, Global Positioning System applications, or NavStar. And then we go all the way up to high Earth orbit, or what's also known as geosynchronous orbit. It's about 22,500 miles up, where they're all around the equator. I have a little bit of a graph here that appears, to be stationary from the ground. So they're moving at a speed where from the ground, it appears stationary, which is why on the ground you have a satellite dish pointing at a certain spot in the sky, because you're communicating with the satellite that's actually moving pretty quickly. What you don't realize is that where we are on the Earth, we're actually moving, whether we realize it or not. We are moving from west to east where we're located right now at a speed of about 700 miles an hour. When you go further south, when you're around the equator, you're moving about 1,000 miles an hour, and that's because the Earth is rotating. We're also actually going a lot faster when you consider, the traverse around the sun each year. We're moving in that velocity of about 66,000 miles an hour. So we're moving, even though it appears stationary to us. And that's kind of a throwback to, Sir Isaac Einstein, who said everything is relative, right? You don't understand that you're moving, but you really are. So when we talk about the high Earth orbit stuff, DirecTV, Dish, GOES, and the weather satellites, those are all positioned up high so that they're able to, pinpoint, locations on the ground to provide, the signals. So the reason that that's important to know about is that there are a lot of influences in orbit that can affect these satellites. They get nudged around a little bit because of the gravity between the Earth and the moon. We also, if you go outside on a sunny day and you look up at the sun and it's nice and those photons are kind of warming you up and you kind of feel the pressure on your face that's caused by the sun. Well, that also pushes satellites around. And what they need to do is keep those satellites exactly where they need to be. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of pissed off DirecTV customers because the signal's gone, right? So it's one of these things that we use onboard propulsion on those satellites to keep them exactly where they need to be. So you nudge them a little bit here and there to keep their orientation. So this just is a quick snapshot. Kind of think of it like you're sitting over the North Pole looking down. You can see the myriad of satellites that are stacked up in orbit over the equator. And I just try to point this out because there's so much out there that you may not be aware of, but it's real. And you see some dead spaces over in the left-hand side. You say, man, there's a lot of territory. Why don't they put a satellite up there? Well, the reason is that that's probably over, the middle of the ocean somewhere where there's nobody that, pays enough to actually support having a satellite overhead. So you see these clusters at various, longitudes, and just gives you a perspective. So about every degree, in certain instances, half a degree of arc or that far out, you'll have satellites overhead. So what do we do in Redmond? So our bread and butter stuff is what we call the liquid engines or monoprop engines, ranging from 2 10-pounders all the way up to a 700-pound engine. Through the history of the site, and this goes all the way back to the Rocket Research Company. We've delivered about 17,000 of these engines. It's more than that now. Each year we're shipping probably anywhere between 400 to 600 engines or so, to the various market segments. And then our customers will install these on their vehicles. So it gives you an idea of what's out there. The mission that was built right here in Redmond is the global positioning system. So we actually built the propulsion systems that were then shipped to our customer and then integrated onto their spacecraft. The one shown here is Block 2F. But what happens is, again, in the GPS systems that are in medium Earth orbit, they actively have to keep them, in their, kind of circularization at a precise knowledge of where they are. And they fly right now about 31 of these satellites, where any 4 can be viewed from any point on Earth. And through, math or calculus, they can actually triangulate where you are in terms of, the location of the satellites. Obviously, the more satellites you have, the better the data, but generally speaking, that's where that runs from. We then talk about what we call bipropellant or hypergolic engines, and there's a suite here that shows kind of what we do here. That's a combination of 2 fuels. You combine 2 fuels to make smoke and fire. So the small one on the left here is a 25-pounder, and you see a shuttle vernier engine. So you'll see that it has kind of a scarfing or an angle on it, and that's because that's the interface or what we call the outer mold line of the actual shuttle. So these would be kind of in the front, in the nose of the vehicle to help, augment what direction they want to push the vehicle. So again, you use all of these engines. Some of them are for landers or apogee engines. Apogee is basically going from low Earth orbit to high, and you're using a main motor to help drive the whole spacecraft up. What's been done in Redmond? Well, I provided an example here where, again, hearkening back to the earlier slide about the space launch system that's supposed to go up here in 2 weeks or so. Up on the upper end is the Orion module, and that's the one that's actually going to go all the way around the moon and back. And there's 12 of these engines that are bipropellant engines on board that vehicle. And they provide each about 100 pounds thrust. They're part of the European service module. So a lot of this, again, is integrated deep in the vehicle, but that's what I would call the Redmond contribution to what's coming up. So a lot of exciting things in the fold. We built here in Redmond a lot of propulsion systems. Some you may not have heard of, some you may have. Themis, was 5 systems that actually went up and supported, call it close continuity between vehicles, so they're talking to each other. Radiation belt storm probe or stereo. A lot of these have specific NASA mission to objectively drive things to a better understanding of the world we live in. I'm gonna focus on 2 of these as part of this presentation, the New Horizons vehicle on the lower left, and then the Parker Solar Probe. But let me go ahead here and jump. The Parker Solar Probe's an interesting one. It was actually launched back in 2018, but that whole propulsion system was built here in Redmond. And I participated on that one myself, but what it does is it's going into the sun. So it's the closest vehicle that's ever approached the sun. And it's going to be about 3.8 miles from the sun at a temperature, call it the skin temperature, of about 2,500 degrees. So that's pretty darn hot. Well, what you see here in this slide up in the upper right-hand corner are those kind of orbital mechanics trajectory orbits as it gets closer and closer and closer, trying to understand the sun and kind of what's going on behind the curtain. You heard this earlier. But it's one of the fastest, if not the fastest, man-made object, moving at a peak speed of about 430,000 miles an hour, because they want to go in real quickly, don't linger too much at temperature, otherwise you cook things, and then come back out. So pretty cool stuff that was done here locally. I'm going to talk real briefly about the electric propulsion stuff that we do here. There's the electrothermal hydrazine thrusters that we call them, as an acronym in the industry, EHT engines. There's a Hall engine, and in the upper right, there's a xenon ion engine. So you hear a lot of this stuff discussed in Hollywood type movies, and we actually do it. We actually build ion engines here in Redmond. The one that I was going to focus on that's somewhat interesting that's coming up, called the DART program. It's a double asteroid redirection test. I don't know what NASA's thinking, but they want to see what's going to happen when they take this propulsion system and they basically drive it into an asteroid, and maybe check out Newton's laws and make sure that, the pinball, the deflections are working. But it was launched in 21, and that whole prop system, including the ion engine that's shown kind of in blue in the middle screen here, was built in Redmond. And it's going to impact this planet, or call it an asteroid, I should say, on the 26th of September. So if you want to see what's going on, you're going to see a spacecraft going to whack an asteroid, and they're going to be monitoring it through a companion vehicle that's alongside to see what happens. So, it's about 1,200 pounds mass, traveling at 14,000 miles an hour, hitting an $11 billion or 11 billion pound asteroid. So I'm not sure what the result's going to be, but that's what they want to find out. So that'll be interesting. Like the proverbial fly hitting the windshield of your car going 70. Let's see. So what I wanted to do is just really highlight that the Redmond site really has been directly involved with going everywhere in our solar system. And I'm trying to highlight here all of the various programs where the Redmond folks, the Rocketeers or rocket scientists, if you will, have actually participated and provided, our expertise in, objectively all of these missions to all of the planets. So it's a pretty cool factor. And I would say one of the greatest accolades that you always compare yourself to other people within the company, and there's like a little bit of a badge of honor to be able to say, I've touched hardware and worked on hardware that's gone to all 9 planets. So that's a pretty cool thing that we talk about. So where's the future going? I wanted to highlight on our rocket engines and how they're outside of our solar system. Voyager 1 and 2 were launched in 77 and 79. They're beyond what we call our solar system or our heliosheath. They're out there traveling to, the future people who are the neighbors in the galaxy that we live in. We don't know, but they're out there. In fact, they're still communicating with the satellites. I know that Voyager 1, they had some problems with software on board that was just recently corrected, and they're now still talking to this satellite that was launched in 1977 that utilizes rocket engines built by Rocket Research that are still active today. So it's quite a legacy to say that, those engines and the effort that went in are still working. A little bit more recently, I mentioned Pluto New Horizons. That was launched not so long ago, but that one is going a little bit faster. So at some point, it's also going to whip out and exit, our solar system. But I know myself, my pride, and certainly a lot of the people at the company now, is that we actually worked on that program. So pretty cool to be able to say, I worked on something that we will never see again. It's gone. It's out of the solar system. So we are really proud of what we do, how we support, not only our local, community here, but nationally, internationally, and for the greater good of, the world. So I wanted to just talk real briefly about where the future lies. There are still a lot of active space exploration programs. Our government is still doing quite a bit of exploring what I'll call as our local planetary systems, with a lot of new things that are going on. Go back to Mars kind of thing, or visit some of the moons of Jupiter. So you'll be hearing about those in the not so distant future. There's also green propellants. I think everyone's pretty aware of how rocket fuels are somewhat toxic. As long as you don't drink the stuff or inhale it too much, it goes well. But there's definitely moves to go a little bit greener. So there's efforts there to, reduce that toxicity effect. And there's lots of things that are being done in Redmond to support that. I will say that 3D printing or printing parts and whatnot is also becoming a real strong push these days because of the complexity of the parts that we talk about. There's also higher power electric propulsion engines. Talk about, sizing things up. Things never go according to plan, but certainly, that's where the challenges are from a technical side. And then if you are aware of the word CubeSats, those are generally defined as one use or multiple use that are 10 centimeter squares. So a 1U CubeSat is 10 centimeters or about 4 inches on a side of a cube. And you can stack these things into rectangle or make them a big cube. I kind of think of them as, the Borgs, if you remember it wasn't the Star Trek thing, but anyway, the Borg and how it was a floating cube. Well, the CubeSat's kind of the same concept. So I don't know if Hollywood made that up or these professors in SLO, but anyway, CubeSats are becoming a real mainstay because, you can group them together. They're of a certain size, and objectively, that's where they get, their missions going forward. So if there's more information, we have a public access site at rocket.com. I will say that name, rocket.com, is actually a legacy name from the old Rocket Research Company. We were actually approached by Estes, the little rocket engines that you can buy in Hobby Lobby, to sell that name, and we didn't. And then when we eventually got acquired, they wanted to sell it, and we protested. And I think everybody in the company is pretty happy that we won, because we still utilize Rocket as the main alias for emails and certainly the website. So a lot of good things there. Last slide here that I have is just a lot of the missions that we have supported. There's a lot of things that we've done, low Earth orbit or discovery, planetary, or as I've mentioned, even outbound interstellar. So that's Aerojet Rocketdyne that we know today.
Wow.
I tried that.
So we're going to take a few questions from you guys. First, a show of hands of people who work for or are associated with rocket research or Aerojet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Holy cow. So we'll do questions from here, and then in a few minutes, Holly will take some questions you'll be seeing from the. So you'll have to speak up, and Jack will repeat your question. So.
Just a quick note of ancient history of rocket research. That little gadget up on stage was built in South Park in 1966, and it was either second or third non-propellant engine that Rocket built.
So what we have on kind of a show display here, thank you, Don, is a early rocket engine that was developed in South Park. So I would suspect about 1961 or something like that. 66. Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, early 25-pound engine. Remarkable. Question back here. Yes, we do. Yeah, the question was, do we sell our rocket engines to, call it international customers? And the answer is yes. We do, and we have numerous customers that are out of Europe, and even the Japanese are a good customer of ours. So internationally, yes. Given the technology worries, there's lots of rigor and things that we need to do to enable that, to protect intellectual property and whatnot, but there's a rigorous process, and certainly that does happen, yes. So that's why our engines are on launch vehicles or spacecraft elsewhere. Question in the back. So the question was, is the ultimate purpose of DART to figure out what can happen, and prevent, call it asteroids from hitting Earth? I think that's what they want to do. That is the mission goal, to find out what can happen if you can just, change the velocity or the vector direction of the asteroid, really gain an understanding of what it would take to help potentially, I would say, set up a Earth defense system for an asteroid that could otherwise, do a lot of potential damage here. Other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Getting back to your remarks on the Artemis thing, you showed that as a solid fuel rocket, but it's got a hydrogen leak, which is liquid.
Yes. So there are various engines on the SLS. So what I was referring to is there's some solid rocket boosters, which kind of think of shuttle. If you recall, they had two strap-ons that are solid rocket boosters. This pertains to the various mix of, liquid combinations or call it solids. So within the core frame of the Artemis vehicle is, a hydrogen, oxygen kind of fuel system. And they've been recently having some problems with seals, right? Because you get things real cold and the seals don't necessarily perform like you want, and they may leak a little bit. So that's what they're trying to resolve. All of this is, you can overcome them, but, as it typically goes on launches, you have a dedicated orbit that you want to make, a trajectory, and there's timing involved. So it's not the only program that's going on at Kennedy. So services, fire crew, all of the things that happen in a complex launch is certainly, call it notable as this one because of the heightened level of interest from the public. You know, they got to get it right. So that's why they try to make sure that everything is just right and that little leaks are not going to lead to big problems.
What's the point of fuel function? We use it, carry all the fuel with it, you know.
Correct. So the question was, how do they figure out the fuel consumption? So that is the mission analysis, and you'd have to take into account all of the variables that can influence, you know, the performance. So as I fondly say, once you're 6 inches off the ground, you can't get it back anymore. So that's why it requires a lot of additional analysis to make sure that you can accomplish the goals that you set out for as part of that mission, and that you have sufficient propellant on board to accomplish that mission. So there's a balancing act between, you know, carrying too much or too little, the cost that it takes, and to make sure that you complement what you need for the payload, or we call the purpose of that mission. So there's a lot of trades that go on constantly in what we'll call the design before it closes, to make sure that everything balances out. So it's quite complex. Yes, sir.
What can you tell us about the engines and fuel left on Voyager?
So what we can say about the fuel left on Voyager, those were hydrazine fuels. So hydrazine is into H4, you know, 2 parts nitrogen, 4 parts hydrogen, and you basically run it through a decomposition catalyst bed, and it takes that stored energy and, you know, decomposes, creating nitrogen, hydrogen, and a little bit of ammonia or so. But that fuel, I don't know how much they have left on board, but they are still communicating with it, and still doing okay. Again, if you think about how far out Voyager is, you know, the pointing accuracies have to be pretty tight, right? Because otherwise you're pointing to Venus, not Earth, right? So they have to make sure that they're pointing right, and that's what they use the little thrusters on board, is just to make sure that, you know, as it's moving in one direction, that it's still pointing in the correct direction. So, you know, that's out of JPL, or the Joint Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California. That's who runs that mission.
What does the future portend with all the space?
That's a big question. You know, I think I saw some number that they are tracking right now, about 48,000, you know, specific pieces of junk, you know, small stuff, big stuff, spent boosters, spacecraft that, you know, have met their life. And it will, you know, become a bigger and bigger problem. So one of the things that I know they're trying to do is come up with ways to potentially bring the space junk back down to Earth, decommission them or auger them into the ocean, or even send them as part of the actual program plans to a safe deorbit area, call it a graveyard orbit. So a lot of what I'll call how people actually apply spacecraft these days are starting to consider more, you know, that disposal effort, and how to not create so much debris that you're constantly having to evade, you know, things that are moving faster than you. The one nice thing about space, it's a big area, you know, it's really huge, a lot of volume. So
you were an engineer,
yes.
high school student, and they foster a program to get ready to apply for the job here.
So the question is, at a young age, what can you do to, you know, orient yourself towards like a rocketeering type job? I didn't start out as a rocket scientist. I started out as a person who was inquisitive. You know, I'm a mechanical engineer at heart, so I like to tinker, if you will, to understand how things work. And I would say that for most of the youth today, that's what I would promote. Try to understand how things work. Don't just take things at face value. Don't just take something and accept it, well, parts obsolescence, throw it, in the trash can, try to do something with it. So if you have that kind of inquisitive or desire to understand how things function, I think you're going to do a lot better in society these days in terms of being able to maybe perhaps contribute and find ways to solve problems instead of create more because, you have a direction or a policy that's like counterintuitive. So yeah, if you want to get into, the rocket science side, as I mentioned earlier, STEM, science, technology, engineering, math are at the core of that answer. Just study hard, work hard, and, you can find a way to make it happen. Were there any questions online? I didn't even ask that. Oh, yes. Have I gone down to the launches? Yes. So the very exciting times, it's the culmination of generally anywhere between a year to 6 years worth of your life that has gone into, the sweat equity, as one might say, investing your time, your effort to not only provide your customer, the products that we do, but also involved with them on the kinds of things that happen at a launch site. A fueling campaign, as an example. I mean, you got to put propellant into the space vehicle or whatever you're dealing with, and then to be able to be there and watch it go and be successful. And that's the cool factor. It's not just building the rocket engines, but actually understanding what their purpose, ultimately is to provide that payload back to us as consumers, or knowledge growth, or whatever. Yep. So that's pretty cool.
Jack, Holly has a couple of questions.
Yes. So Holly, we have a couple of questions. Go ahead, and if you can broadcast those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I personally was curious. We have a 2018 poster celebrating 50 years of Aerojet Rocketdyne here in our office. I was curious if you know of any other events or projects that celebrated that benchmark.
So the question is, are there any other events? I will say that the company is pretty quiet. We're private. We are a national asset. So there's a lot of things that we do internal that do not get broadcast externally for a real strong purpose, which is not only international, call it intellectual property, but also the management of cybersecurity and access to the things that we do. So like you'll see pictures of individuals, but we do not have name tags on ourselves anymore. So there's a real conscious decision on the part of the company to promote where we think it's best. Like the 50-year anniversary was a celebration of being on site as part of the original rocket research company, 50 years of occupying the site and doing what we do. However, I will say that there was a really big scrub on what was shared. That's just a natural outcome of what we do. I know that there was a presentation, and I know there's a desire to get that presentation. I don't know, maybe I can go back and ask again, but what that did was highlight, all of the capabilities. There was a lot of celebration with a lot of the local community, but yeah, we generally speaking are pretty quiet. I mean, like the stickers that we saw up on the screen, those are typically done by our customer, right? Call it the mission stickers. But yeah, we don't do much to promote what we do, which is part of the reason I'm here today, is to tell you a little bit more about what we're up to, where I can, but certainly, unfortunately, we don't have any upcoming near-term events to complement that question. It would require some effort to tour the facility. Yes, yes. U.S. citizens verifying who you are, all of that. So yeah, there's a whole raft of things that we worry about. Yeah, another question? I can't tell you that. The question was if we do anything top secret at our facility.
I
I won't even go that far. Anyway, there was another question, Holly.
Sure. I was also curious, for those that are interested in sort of the history of rockets and rocketeering more broadly, are there any resources you would suggest or any rocketeers you would suggest looking into?
So the question had to do with, learning a little bit more about rockets and kind of how those are involved. NASA really does a good job of publishing a lot of information on this kind of stuff. So I would, do those kinds of searches through the educational forums that they promote. So that would be a good start. And then from that, there's a lot of individuals that, have websites that are dedicated to rocketry. What I find especially cool, the cool factor, and it's a good time of year to do this, is to go outside on a clear night at sunset, just after sunset, call it the dusk periods at night, and just look overhead and try to spot the satellites. You'll see them. You never knew they were there, but you'll see them moving again from west to east or north to south. What happens is a lot of the lower satellites will gain a reflection of the sun off of a panel or some other flat surface, and you'll see them as a moving dot in the sky. So a pretty cool factor to share with family members. I tried to show my kids at an early age when we went camping. Who spots the most satellites, gets a candy bar or something, okay. So be creative, but it again is reflective of how there's a whole world around us and how, Redmond and the greater population has contributed to that. So any other questions here from the floor? I couldn't even begin to guess. Thousands. There's actually, it depends on where you talk, right? So some of the satellites that we talk about, like geo orbit, there's hundreds, and then there's some that have expended their lives that are sent to what we call a graveyard orbit. Then there's low Earth orbit, and a lot of them auger in. They call it, so they come in. Space junk is coming in all the time. If you are aware of the news. Solid rocket boosters, that are used to push the vehicles up. Oftentimes, have slow decay and come in. So there's always, I don't know how many satellites there are, but definitely tens of thousands. Yep. So Holly, you want to do the wrap?
Sure. We have time for just one more question. So I thought maybe we would end on kind of a fun note. You mentioned, seeing rockets in movies and TV. You mentioned Star Trek specifically. So I was wondering, is there a movie or a TV show you think really gets it right, that's sort of accurate to your experience?
Well, yeah, the big one is The Right Stuff. That could be a go-to first, to understand how complex things are and how difficult things are. You got to realize that especially for human rated missions, when these astronauts are sitting on top of, millions of pounds of like packed gunpowder, it's kind of scary if you think about it. It's a controlled explosion that, is risky. So nothing comes easy. And, the whole purpose of what we do is to try and make sure that through our contributions that we're doing our part to make sure the parts are right to support, those launches. So yeah, it's not easy at all.
Well, thank you, Jack. And I wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. If anyone has any questions or feedback about our program today, you can write me at manager@redmondhistoricalsociety.org. Please join us next month on October 8th for another very special Saturday Speaker Series program, How Audio Technology Changed the World with Ross Reynolds. You can find more information about this event on redmondhistoricalsociety.org, as well as details on our upcoming evening speaker program, visits to our display space, and more. So we hope to see you all again soon. And until next time, take care.